Hi there, I'm going to do a movie review for Interstellar. This movie came out in 2014, and it's written and directed by Christopher Nolan, starring Matthew McConaughey and Anne Hathaway. Um, it's one of those movies I've always had a problem with. It looks great, but the story is to me playing on the fears of a generation, I guess you could say. This is a movie where global warming has essentially made our planet, starting to make our planet uninhabitable. And the whole joke of the whole movie is how much it's uninhabitable. But the problem, like Interstellar, basically they they're running into a problem with climate change. And Matthew McConaughey's character has to go outside. He's a former NASA astronaut. He has to go outside the bounds of the Earth to get to find a new planet. Basically, if I remember right, they got a theory about a new planet. You gotta go through a black hole to find it, and basically, we gotta find a new home. Um, the film was basically just a shoe-in for I don't know, almost a shoe-in for fairly accurate, mildly accurate interpretation of physics, I guess you could say. I guess one of the more accurate interpretations of physics in terms of Hollywood movies, at least. There's definitely movies that have done it better, but this movie was more or less about you know, the story itself, for some reason, they decided to shoe in the idea of climate change in this movie. So they had the climate change, so that humanity is kind of running out of food or having problems at home, and they have to find a new planet. So they got to rocket up into space, and indeed they do. Um, it's a movie that's entirely. I feel like the whole story is just based around the idea of a shoehorn for spectacular visual effects. This movie is like spectacular looking in every shot. It's once again the space. Everything's good looking. They're riding on a craft that's sort of wonky. It doesn't have a lot of aerodynamics because it doesn't need any aerodynamics. It's basically designed for space. It's a fairly clunky design. But nonetheless, they rocket through space, and they have all the common theories about space are kind of there to see on the screen. I mean, they rocket past Jupiter, and eventually they sort of find a black hole. But of course, instead of a black hole being a little circle in space, it's a sphere. So, they have to go to the sphere. Um, I think my biggest I didn't mind the movie too much, but it runs into this problem of the main story is about you have to get off planet Earth because of climate change. To find a new planet would require an enormous effort. Again, this movie just seems like a shoehorning in the concept of showing us all this elaborate visual effects, and that's really all it's about. It's not really about effective physics. They go through the wormhole, and it's so funny because it's not a particularly it's all very spectacular looking. They do a very good job of making everything look good. A lot of time was spent rendering this movie in a rendering farm. That's basically all you can say about it. Just a huge amount of effort on visual effects. The actors do a pretty good job. I mean, I can't imagine. I don't think this movie has quite as much green screen as some people think it does. From what I understand about Christopher Nolan, he does try to do a lot of sets and practical methods of displaying things. Like he tries to have you in the set. Although most movies made in the last 20 years, where the set is and where the green screen is not entirely clear. In fact, you'll often find it rather impressive just how much green screen there is. But nonetheless, some directors actually try to emphasize as much practical as possible, as much set design as possible. But again, movies are tons and tons of visual effects now, and this movie is all like tons of visual effects. Um, it contains an amazing sequence involving basically a black hole where they experience severe time dilation. And they go to this planet where every second or so, I think it's like every 1.25 seconds, is basically a day passes on the craft. Like they had to separate. They have this big craft that they go fly across, zipping across the space, and they find this black hole, and they have to go to the surface of a planet that's near the black hole, and it's experiencing severe time dilation. Get down there, and the basic plan is they got to find something there, and it becomes a problem because when they get down on the planet, they find out that what they think is mountains in the distance is actually waves. It's not like they're on a planet that's got water all over the place. And of course, they think that what's in the distance is just mountains, and they're actually waves, and they're coming, and they realize that they got a certain amount of time to get out of here. Inevitably, they get caught up in this wave, and this costs them a lot of time. Jeffrey Wright, I believe it is, was on board the on board the main vessel, and he has to basically try and figure out how to. They gotta try and figure out how to get back. The biggest problem is to get caught in the wave. And the wave becomes a bit of a problem because they get caught in the wave, and then suddenly it costs them at least over 6 minutes. It's horrible though, because the guy on the ship has to sit there and wait and hope that this didn't go completely bad. But nonetheless, they end up getting back. But it was like 20 years when they get back to their main place. Nonetheless, yeah, I could have that name wrong. I forget. It's been a little while since I've seen this movie, so I'm not entirely sure who's doing what. But nonetheless, it's it creates a problem for itself where everything they're doing is in the name of, the last sequence is kind of like the most intriguing and the most like a curious scene. Basically, he ends up having to communicate to his daughter on what to do. He's got to send signals through time-space warp, basically, to get his daughter's attention to know that he's stuck somewhere and she has to do something about it. I don't know. Again, this movie is a shoe-in for physics, a trial and error on physics, space physics. So, more or less, everything in this movie is meant to be a metaphor on what we think the world's going to be like out there. But nonetheless, I don't know. It gets a little bit silly about itself because, of course, I don't know how they're expecting to find a planet on the other side of a wormhole that's effective for humanity. How they're expecting to get everybody there is beyond me. It seems like more like a shoehorn for elaborate. It's just it's an excellent reason to have good visual effects. Unfortunately, the reasoning for them is a little bit lopsided because even the one school teacher says to the main character, he's like to Matthew McConaughey's character, I don't think that they landed on the moon. And of course he says, well, of course they landed on the moon. You don't think they landed on the moon? And this is the joke, is that he's about to go off into space, and the teacher doesn't think that anybody landed on the moon. So he's kind of finding this incredible to believe that somebody doesn't believe they landed on the moon. And yet he's about to go off into space to find a wormhole, to go and find a planet. Nonetheless, it's very elaborate visual effects, very elaborate. The story itself, though, isn't particularly interesting. I found that was the worst thing about it. It works well for those people who believe these concepts and these stories. It doesn't work so well if you don't really like the concept in the story. It gets kind of boring after a while. It gets kind of repetitive. The problem is too much time is spent on elaborate scenery and not enough time doing other things. But nonetheless, it works out in the end. He ends up finding a way to communicate with his daughter. He's way out of sync with her in the timeline. But yeah, they sort of end up figuring out a plan for the future. Of course, again, the movie's visual effects are just spectacular. It's a movie that was made for IMAX basically and big screens. If you have a big screen TV, all the better for you. Um, Visual effects wise, great movie. And unfortunately, the story is like pretty pretty plain Jane actually. It's not that interesting. But yeah, there's that.